Dr. Raj Vedam, who is a professional in engineering and computer science, but for the past 24 more years, during his days at India's premier institution, Indian Institute of Science, where he graduated in engineering and mathematics, it has been his passion to delve deep into the history, ancient histories of Indian civilization as it has been recorded, right, in the many books that have been available to us so far. And with his passion for mathematics and astronomy, he has taken a lot of interest lately in what we call archaeoastronomy. That is, in our times we see many disciplines that are seemingly unrelated coming together, see that kind of a unification, and through the applications of the theories and knowledge that are available in individual disciplines, in that confluent model we have been able to make major leaps, right, in regions of knowledge. And that's exactly what Dr. Vedam has been doing for the past many years, bringing mathematics, astronomy, and computer science, I should say, together. He has been delving very deep into the recorded histories of Indian civilizations to include the scriptures, right, records that talk about Indian philosophical systems and the great personages that conceived those time-tested ideas. And he has been trying ever since to actually rewrite history by giving it much greater accuracy and precision. So that's been his passion, that's the journey he has undertaken for the past 20 plus years. So it's my pleasure and an honor to actually receive Dr. Vedam and spend the next hour and 15 minutes with you so that he can share with you everything he knows about ancient Indian history, especially the story Untold.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for it. Thank you. Can you hear my voice back there, or should I be louder? No problem? Can you understand my accent? No problem? Outstanding. Outstanding. So I chose my title deliberately a bit provocative, right? The untold story. What's there to be told? We read in our textbooks, we know the media. Is there really an untold story? That is what I hope to talk to you all today. I hope to bring in evidence-based narration to the study of Indian history. And when I say evidence-based, I mean I'm a scientist, so I bring in the bias of science, right? If somebody were in a different area of study, they bring in the biases, the lenses that their field of study gives them. So I bring in astronomy, I bring in mathematics, I bring in geology, I bring in climate change, and I bring in many other aspects of scientific inquiry to try and address some of the outstanding questions that we have. So this is the way of science or any learning today. You have textbooks where a whole host of, there's a consensus of opinion that this is what people must study in classrooms and so on. But it doesn't mean the textbooks are set forever and ever. Everything in a textbook can be critiqued, questioned, and researched. And that is what we as research scholars do, right? We take something that is well known, you think everybody knows everything about it, and there you go find new evidence that goes contrary to a narrative out there. And you come saying, trying to explain why that is so. So today's talk should be taken in that spirit. It's a spirit of a new inquiry into the narration of Indian history. So if there are times when you scratch your head wondering, we are learning one thing from our textbooks and this guy is saying something completely different, I'd like you to open your minds to the evidence that's being presented, okay? So let's jump into the talk. Hopefully this is working. And one more. So I have a team that's called Indian History Awareness and Research, and we critique issues of interest in Indian history. So before we start, I'd like to point out that history refers to inquiry, knowledge acquired by investigation. That is the kindest interpretation that we can take of this word, history. So typically we use archaeology, epigraphs, scripts, linguistics, foreign records, the usual sources, and it tends to remain in the humanities or social sciences. Like I said, I bring in the lens afforded by science to look at prehistory, and I'll make a case for enormous antiquity of Indians using the archaeogenetics, archaeoastronomy, and knowledge systems. And in doing so, I'll make a case for an untold story of India. This is my thesis. My thesis is that there are several paradoxes in Indian history. The Indian civilization is a very ancient one, but it's currently positioned otherwise in common narratives. I will explain a little more about this. The Indian civilization have been knowledge producers, but they are positioned otherwise in the common discourse. There are very strong index sources and references, but these are ignored, devalued, and discredited. And I'm calling out that we need a critique of methods and scientific validation of narratives. To set the stage, here is one more of the greatest dishonesties of our times, if you can call it that. What we learn from our textbooks, narratives, and so on is that the Indian civilization impacted every civilization to its east, right? From Malaysia, Sumatra, Thailand, Burma, going on to Japan, Korea, China, and all of these nations. But it did not step 1 foot outside Afghanistan. It should just strike you as something very odd. If there's a narrative that we are learning today that tells us this, it's a very odd thing. So I call that one of the greatest dishonesties. So to go to the background of all of these things, we need to go to the roots of who are the guys who wrote the modern narration of Indian history. And to do that, we need to go back to European times, European Indology, because that sets a stage for erasure, distortions, errors, and widespread devaluation and discrediting of Indic sources, resulting in a loss of continuity of the Indic past and loss of history of the Indic civilization. I put a select few gentlemen here. These are not the only guys who are complicit in this narration of history. So William Jones, he came to India, to Calcutta, and was a founder of the Asiatic Society. So he observed that there were common roots between Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek. And he scratched his head, how can this be? These are civilizations so widely separated, and how can they have common roots? So he postulated that they probably had some kind of contact, and he postulated that somebody called Aryan, who must have come to all of these countries. So he started that idea initially. So he also distorted Puranic genealogies. What does that mean? How many of you here heard the term Puranas? None of you. Okay, so one has heard back there. Puranas refer to history as it is told in the Indic tradition. And these contain king lists and genealogies that go back to about 5,000 years or so. Now, these gentlemen who came from England in those days were the products of the English education system of that period, where every decent educated gentleman believed that the world was created in 4004 BCE. So they were the product of the Anglican Church thinking, which postulated a creation date of 4004 BCE. Further, they also fervently believed that there was a flood, Noah's flood, around 3000 BCE, because of which you couldn't find any history prior to that. So when they encountered Puranic genealogies that were 5,000, 6,000 years old, they said, this can't be. So they took it upon themselves to correct the Indian genealogies. So they cherry-picked some things from here and there, those kinds of things. And in the process, started the introduction of distortions in the genealogies. Bentley was a very interesting gentleman who was a minister in the Anglican Church, and he also confronted with the same problem that Indian astronomy hinted great antiquity, measurements that were of great antiquity. He said this can't be true. So he postulated that all of the measurements are forgeries done in recent times and backdated to show antiquity. Very interesting allegations from him. Max Muller, I think most of you might have heard that he was a person who did a lot of linguistic analysis, the dating of the Vedas, the dating of various other things. So he used linguistic methodology to propose dates for Indian methodologies. He too contributed to something called AIT. How many of you know this acronym, AIT? Aryan, good.
Aryan invasions.
Absolutely, yes, Aryan invasion theory, yes, that's what it is. He too contributed to this idea. Very interesting gentleman called Herbert Risley. He was an anthropologist who used the methods of his times to propose something what he thought was innovative. So he said let's measure the width of the nose and the height of the nose and make a metric out of that. And based on that metric, let's start categorizing people. Today it might sound absolutely ridiculous that somebody could do something like that, but that's exactly what he proposed back then. So he used what is called the discredited race science to do that, and he entrenched the notion of Aryans as a race, and he also entrenched the notion of caste system in the census of 1901. He was the census commissioner for India. So what he did was he tried to categorize the various people he was visiting in India. So he made a gazette. In the gazette he listed these 2,000 odd castes, what he called castes. And most of you know that was a pre-computer era, right, in the 1900s. So if somebody were to write down 2,000 names in a gazette, what would you expect? They're going to use alphabetical order, right, for easy retrieval of information. But this gentleman, he ordered them by social preference. So once again, bringing in subjective biases and ideas into the discourse and entrenching the ideas, certain ideas that Anglicans wanted to impose in the Indian society. So there's a great quest that exists even today for an Indian identity. Many Indians struggle with this issue of what is our identity. And the common narrative says that Aryans invaded India in 1500 BCE, and they drove the existing Dravidians to the south. They imposed the Vedic religion, and there's oppression of Dravidians by the Brahminical priesthood, and oppression caused Dravidian backwardness and poverty. And today there is a strong discourse that says Dravidians are a separate race and religion. So these discourses in India have given rise to enormous angst in the people and enormous divisions, which people are still trying to reconcile, understand who they are. So today the quest for the identity continues. People look at those as religious identities, caste identities, the so-called Aryan Dravidian identity, regional identities, language identities. And there are many modern kids who go around saying, I only have a corporate identity, I work for Google, I work for Apple, and those kinds of things. And some more enlightened kids are out there saying, I'm a world citizen. I don't belong to anything. These are all symptomatic of people who have lost a connection with their past, who don't have a sense of identity. So the discourse continues even today into who we are. So I will try to show that these are all distorting identities and undermines underlying framework of unity, and some of them are utterly spurious. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Aryan Dravidian identity. So my goal here today is to introduce science as a measure of trying to rationally analyze these narratives and say, what can we make out of these narratives? So I'll bring in archaeoastronomy, genetics, archaeology, geology, and climate studies. Hopefully there's enough time to cover all that. So I'm going to cover the following. Is the Aryan invasion migration theory valid? How ancient is the Indian civilization? What did the ancient Indians know? Was India a source or a sink for knowledge? And I'll highlight the untold story in each of these areas. So the first question, was there something called an Aryan invasion or migration? Because that goes to the root of what you study in your textbooks and what Indians believe they are. So let's go to that. What is it? I only saw one hand going up for Aryan invasion theory, so I presume I must tell you guys what an Aryan invasion is. So this theory states that bands of male warriors, it's very important, each of these words are important because they are all nuanced. There are nuances over there that carry over to the battlefields today. So the bands of male warriors from Central Asia invaded or migrated to India around 1500 BCE. They effectively replaced the existing civilization and brought an entirely new Vedic religion, Sanskrit language, and Vedic ecosystem. So this is the story. And if you remember, I told you that William Jones found similarity between Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. And ever since that time, the Europeans were interested in knowing who are we as a people. So we're talking to the Indians and the Aryans, but the question is who are we as a people and where did we come from? So the quest for Indian identity today is rooted in the quest for the Western identity. So the Western people need to say who they are as a people. So that is what I'll point out over here. So one of the first tools that people used in those days to address this, obviously, they were looking at languages. So they show us how can we study languages and categorize the people who speak these languages. So they use the notion of linguistic analysis where you bring in about 200 words or so, let us say. 200 words from candidate languages. If you're interested in about 10 candidate languages, you take universal words like hand, face, eat, run, go, kill, sleep. You know, these are the universal words in every language. Use those things and make a study of how does a phoneme change from one language to the other. How does a syllable change from one language to the other? Then you have a notion of, for these 200 words, which language is closest to this language. If some language is very close in a statistical sense, then you put them close to each other by a tree link. If it is further away, you try to find its relative and find its place in the chain. And that eventually gives rise to a tree graph of this nature, where the early Europeans, early meaning the 17th, 18th century guys, they postulated that the commonality of languages implies there was an ancestral language called Proto-Indo-European. This was the ancestral postulated language. There isn't a language like that. It is a postulation. There's nobody in the world who ever is known to have spoken a Proto-Indo-European language. So it's only a postulation. So they put that at the source, and in doing so, they came with Balto-Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, Italic, Hellenic, Iranian, Indic, and over here is Sanskrit. I'd like to point out that comparative method, internal reconstruction were the ones used to do this. This is an idealization. As a scientist, to me, this has got no notion of time. This has got no notion of chronology. This has only got a notion of distance. I hope you guys understand what I'm saying. So in mathematics, we learn of something called a similarity transformation. It means that if I have a matrix here today, I can define a new matrix called a similarity transformation and define a multiplication of those two and get a new matrix, entirely different rule. What it means is instead of taking Proto-Indo-European as a root, I could just as well have taken Sanskrit as a root and defined a new matrix, and everything remains absolutely the same. To give you guys a visual idea of what this means, if you were to sit in Houston and say, what's the distance to Washington, D.C., what's the distance to Los Angeles, what's the distance to Portland, Oregon, what's the distance somewhere else? You see what I'm saying? You're going to get a set of numbers. Now, instead of taking Houston as a source, you go, let's say, to Orlando and say the same city. What's the distance from Orlando to Houston, Orlando to Portland? Do you think the numbers will change? Related to where you are, right? Related to Orlando, it's going to change. But the nature of the numbers did not change. Do you see that? I can go from the source Orlando to Houston with just a simple mathematical transformation. So that's what I meant. This is not a complete picture. This is only a snapshot of the distances and so on from languages. So people recognized these issues and said, all right, let's fortify our narratives by also bringing in archaeology. If linguistics alone can't tell us what's happening, let's see if we can get archaeological artifacts and try to correlate these things. So the quest for the identity continues, and again, Indian identity is key in the positioning of the Western identity. Aryan invasion theory is the centerpiece and the tail end of the Western narrative. And why do I say that? Today, there are two major thought leaders in this narration. One of them is Professor Maria Gimbutas, who in 1950s, she proposed the Kurgan or the steppe hypothesis. So she said that Indo-Aryan expansionism happened in 3 waves, starting around 4000 BCE and ending much later. On the other side is Professor Colin Renfrew, 1987 or so, from Cambridge, who said that the invention of agriculture in Anatolia, which is Turkey, and the subsequent spread of agriculture was the impetus for language also to follow. You guys understand what I'm saying? So agriculture and expansion, 6500 BCE. Today there are people going around saying genetics seems to be favoring the Kurgan hypothesis, and 6500 BC that this gentleman says is too old for the PIE language. But the battle continues on, and people studying these things even today. So what is the Kurgan hypothesis? As scientists, we need to do that. If you're going to the root of a problem, you need to define the problem, tell the world you understand the problem, and then show what you're going to do about it. So this one says the Proto-Indo-European people emanated from the Yamna culture, approximately the area between Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And the archaeological thing for them is the open grave burial culture. This open grave burial culture is called Kurgan. Okay? You see the word Kurgan, it comes from the open grave. Once they domesticated the horse, they were able to move out of this area. And they also found stone waves, idols, and the movement was in wave 1 and wave 2. I'd like to point out that this is not the story of civilization. This is only the story of the hypothetical Proto-Indo-European people, because at that time there are already people in Harappa, Birana, Mehrgarh, Bhimbetka, Lothal, Edekal in Kerala, Sumeria, Egypt. You already had civilizations here. So it's not a story of civilization, it's only the story of a postulated migration. So around 2500 BCE, these people moved on into Western Europe and became something called the corded ware people. I'll show some examples of corded ware archaeology later. And on the eastern side was the Andro-Novo people. And here you see the consolidation of these people into Indus Valley civilization, the Elamites, the Sumerians, and the Egyptians. And moving further, 1500 BCE, you see that these people have been refined further in Western Europe, become the Greek Mycenaean people, the Hittites, Babylonians, and the BMAC culture, Bactria, Margiana, Archaeological complex. And you see, if you recognize the shape of India over here, this is Gujarat, and this is Sindh, this Pakistan area. You see the Aryan invasion theory appears here in the hypothesis. So what you're seeing is, it has appeared the tail end of a narrative over here. By 500 BCE, the story says these people consolidated themselves in central India, and appearance of a people called Dravidian over here. And on this side, you see the British people, the Celtic people have further refined Italic Greeks and the Semitic people, and so on and so forth. So this is a story. Here's an example of archaeology. This is a Kurgan burial mound, and this is burial mound from the, Kazakhstan, 500 BCE. This is a typical burial where you find implements of the dead person and so on. And 4,000-year-old chariot burial in Georgia. Remember, the story says the invention of domestication of horse and chariot were the things that assisted this expansionism. So here's an example of a chariot burial. You observe this chariot has got no spokes, but if you guys have seen movies like Ben-Hur and those kinds of things, you see chariot with spokes and all those kind of things. This one does not have spokes. This is a solid wooden chariot only. I told you to say what corded ware is. This is an example of corded ware. This striations that you find in the pottery. So when the clay is still wet, the innovation was to tie a cord or a rope around it so to leave its mark around. You see that? That innovation is recognized in archaeology as a corded ware people, and here are some examples of that. So I'm going to now start examining the evidence. I've given you a background, and now I'm going to talk to you with evidence. How many of you guys still think I'm talking sense? Thank you, thank you. Some of you at least do that. Ask me questions. Stop and ask me questions if you have any doubts at any point. Okay? So each of us is a walking archaeogenetic artifact. Okay? Each of you contain the sum total of the genetic mutations of all your ancestors. Okay? Going back to time, provided they still remain in your genetic record and have not become genetic debris after generations of mutation. Okay? So we are walking archaeoastronomic genetic artifacts. So the methodology that people use is they either they use a saliva swab. Okay? Use a saliva swab and do genetic sequencing. And once you do genetic sequencing, you can start answering some questions. Maternal mitochondrial DNA field data. They also use the Y chromosome field data. And once a field data has been collected and once some kind of analysis has been done at the sequencing point, then they are in a position to do a lot of mathematical analysis. For those of you interested, I can go deep into what the mathematics is. Having finished the mathematics, you're left with a bunch of numbers. And now you're in an unenviable position of taking numbers and making sense in the real world. Okay? When you take numbers and they convert that into a narrative, saying that this is what happened. So that's a final one, inference by mapping to the real world. So whenever we talk about genetic methodology, we need to pay homage to this professor, Luca Cavalli Sforza. He wrote this very influential book, The History and Geography of Human Genes, I think sometime in the 90s, 94 book. And he studied human evolution and human population history by looking at the differences among the genomes of different people. And very similar to linguistics, he said, if you study how close is the average genome of this population related to the average genome of this population, we might be in a position to say the genetic distance between us. Those are the ideas that he introduced into the discourse. In this, I'd like to talk to you about the work of a professor, Stephen Oppenheimer. Okay? He's written a very, very influential book called The Real Eve. I strongly suggest reading this, Out of Eden, The Real Eve, available on Amazon. It's a 2003 book, which means you can get it for a couple of dollars or $3. So he used a maternal mitochondrial DNA to do the mapping of who are we as a people. His story begins sometime in 140,000 years ago, when he said, modern man meaning Homo sapien, cranial capacity the same as you and me, morphologically looking similar to you and me, able to do similar abstract things that you and I can do. So he said modern man came from Africa and left Africa in a certain time frame, and that's where my story begins. 85,000 to 75,000 years ago, a band of people crossed this Gulf of Oman and migrated along this region, which is in Iran, Sindh, Gujarat, and the triangular part of India, onward up to almost Taiwan. So there are two questions I typically answer over here. People ask me, what was the migration model? Was it a group of guys just started walking, and so on? No, that is not the case at all. That is not at all the case. The nearest example we have today is the Bushman society. In the Bushman society, they don't have any possessions. So they have no leader, nothing. They live in one place, and if after living for a few years they find that there's no game nearby for hunting, or they polluted the land, or lack of water, what do? They take their entire family and go 1 kilometer down the road and start a new family again. You see what I'm saying? Generation by generation move out. This is what it is. So it is not one of, hey, let's walk all the way to Australia. No, it is not that at all. So it is a generation by generation over an exceedingly long period of time, thousands and thousands of years. That is the model that we're seeing over here. Next model, why did they not head westwards? Why did they come eastwards? In the period of time that we're talking about, there was one more species of human living in that part of the world. Can anybody guess what human might have been? Yeah, you're on top of these things. Yes, the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal. Yes, the Neanderthal lived up to Iran. They lived all over Europe and up to Iran, the Chagai Hills of Iran. That's the boundary till which we have found artifacts of Neanderthals. Okay? Today, the Homo sapien is about 6 feet tall, maybe about 170 pounds, with generations of good nutrition and so on. But if we go back in time, the Homo sapien was puny, maybe 4 feet, 5 inches, maybe 40 kilograms, 50 kilograms. That's about it. So they did not want to get in confrontation with the Neanderthals, who were much bigger than them. So Stephen Oppenheimer says these guys were beach huggers. They hugged the beach because their technology was just enough to survive them. And he's found archaeological artifacts that they left behind, things like shellfish that they ate and the remnants of the shells and all those kind of things. In certain archaeological layers, they found them all over the place to claim this kind of a movement. 75,000 years ago, there was a major event in that part of the world. There was a super volcano. The nearest super volcano we know about here is near the Dakotas. But over here, what you see is there was a super volcano in Sumatra about 75,000 years ago. And this caused a 6-year nuclear winter, an instant 1,000-year ice age. The population crashed to less than 10,000 breeding individuals genetically. Okay, 10,000 breeding individuals. Volcanic ash from the eruption up to 5-meter deep covered both India and Pakistan. So you can imagine if a eruption happened here and covered India with so much of ash, it was an exceedingly traumatic event which caused a depression of the human population to almost zero, and the remaining population was reinitialized into survivors. This here is an archaeological dig in a place in Jwalapuram. Jwalapuram is approximately here in the eastern part of India, Andhra Pradesh, where even now under a certain layer they're finding ash from that event. And what is more exciting, under the ash layer they're finding the implements of that ancient human. What does that tell you? That means there were people who were living before the ash event, and then the ash event, and then there are implements they find on top of that also. Very interesting. 65 to 52,000 years ago, something happened, and that something happening is warming that took place in Western Europe. Okay, that warming coincided with the dying out of the Neanderthals. Nobody today can answer why do the Neanderthals die? Did they die of disease, or did they die of warfare, or the human Homo sapien was more intelligent and he outmaneuvered them? We don't know. But all we know is they disappeared from the fossil record, from our archaeological record. We don't find them. That vacuum was filled by groups of people who left this part of India, which is approximately Gujarat, Sindh, and so on, and moved into the Bosphorus. Bosphorus is the entry point into Western Europe, and this happened approximately 50,000 years ago. And here you can see man has come up to Australia in this time frame. And about 40 to 25,000 years ago, you find that they have reached up to Spain and other areas here, and here up to Siberia. And also you notice that one group of people from this part of India, western part, another from the eastern part of India, another from these areas, they crossed the Bering Strait. At that point there was a land bridge because of the ice and so on, and they crossed and became the future North Americans and South Americans. Okay? So this is the point approximately 40 to 25,000 years ago. That is my background for the migration of ancient people. And you guys need to stop me here and say, Dr. Vedam, you've been talking about incidents that are 30,000 years old, but the Aryan invasion is supposed to be 3,000, 4,000 years old. So can we have some resolution in this time frame? And that's what I'd like to start doing by presenting to you research papers. Okay? This paper is from 2013 in the American Journal of Human Genetics, Genetic Evidence for Recent Population Mixture in India by Priya Murjani, Kumaraswamy Thangaraj, and David Reach, very famous names out there. And they were interested. They took one of the largest samples of contemporary Indians today and tried to genetically analyze them from different categories, different parts of India and so on, to address who are these guys and what can we tell anything about their ancestry. So they postulated, let's take something called an ancestral North Indian, ANI, and an ancestral South Indian called ASI, and try to talk about modern people in relation to these ancestral populations. What they found is that ANI and ASI diverged from a common ancestor 60,000 years ago, correlating very well with what Stephen Oppenheimer said. Stephen Oppenheimer said 70,000 years ago, ancient man entered into the Indian subcontinent, right? These guys said their results show that the ANI and ASI diverged 60,000 years ago, and they existed side by side without mixing for an exceedingly long period of time. Until approximately 4,000 years ago, something happened, 2000 BCE, something happened, and these people started marrying between themselves, mixing, a lot of mixing in the population. So this happened for a period of 2,000 years. Until the turn of the Common Era, you find that people remained endogamous, marrying within their own communities. I'd like to prompt you to not jump to conclusions and think that is the beginning of the caste system in India, because I'm going to debunk that whole notion just a little while later. Okay? But this is just a background. What does our genetics tell us? Regardless of what archaeology tells us, regardless of what any other method of inquiry tells us, this is what genetics is telling us. These people concluded their paper by saying that their works does not imply migration from West Eurasia into India during this time. On the contrary, what they're saying is they failed to find any evidence of shared ancestry between the ancestral North Indian and groups in West Eurasia within the past 12,500 years. Very, very, very powerful conclusion. What they're trying to tell us, when we try to see, does our saliva samples and genetic samples, do they show evidence of Central Asian genes in the Indian subcontinent? They said if we go back 2,000 years, no evidence. 4,000 years, no evidence. 6,000 years, no evidence. They said you must go back 12,500 years, the genetic record, to find trace amounts of Central Asian genes. Very, very powerful conclusion, because this completely demolishes the so-called Aryan invasion of 1500 BCE. One more paper in 2012, this one is in PLOS. Population differentiation of southern Indian male lineages correlates with agricultural expansion predating the caste system. The common narrative says that once the Aryans came to India, 500 BCE, you find the appearance of the Dravidian people. They imposed their system on the Dravidian people, a system meaning caste system on the Dravidian people. So caste system in southern India should have been approximately 500 BCE onwards, right? That's the implication of that narrative. However, what he said is, they studied 1,680 individuals from Tamil Nadu in caste and tribe societies and showed genetic differentiation is 6,000 years old. In other words, endogamy, if you can think of endogamy as a proxy for caste system, it is more than 6,000 years in southern India. It predates the so-called Aryan invasion by more than 2,000 to 3,000 years. So genetics is always throwing up something like this. One more common discourse you find in India is people point out the northern latitudes and they say that the northern Indian is of a fairer skin tone than the southern Indian who's of a darker skin tone. So surely this means we are two different people, two different races and so on. Well, genetics has got an answer for that too, because we found that in this 2013 paper, an allele called SLC24A5, that's a mutation that appears in the 15th chromosome of the human body, okay? That mutation controls the expression of melanin and how you're going to respond if you go and sit out there in the sun. Okay? Some of us merely turn red, whereas some of us get darker skin because of the result of how melanin interacts over there. It's a result of the body's control systems trying to decide how much of vitamin D should your body produce. In the northern latitudes, you need more of it. Southern latitudes, you don't need much of it. Southern meaning closer to the equator, you don't need much of it. So this gene is common for between Europeans and South Asians and is responsible for skin tone. This appeared in the mutation record just 30,000 years ago. That too we know from genetics. So it appeared in the mutation record just 30,000 years ago. It's mostly in ancestral North Indian, but also in some southern Indians. I'd like to point out how skin tone today is involved in so much of identity issues that we carry around as baggage even today. So very recently you might have seen this picture of the Cheddar Man. How many of you know Cheddar Man? One person knows that. So Cheddar Man, you find in a museum in Britain, UK today. And this gentleman over here reconstructed from genetic evidence as well as from skeleton that they found and other things and some did. And the recent record report came 2 or 3 weeks back says that early Britain from 10,000 years ago had dark skin and blue eyes. Okay, dark skin and blue eyes. So the Proto-Indo-European advocates say the dark-skinned natives of Britain were replaced by pale-skinned PIE invaders and migrants around 1000 BCE to that part of the world. So the narration, if you remember the picture I showed you, Yamna culture, people going there, you remember that, right? That is the expansion of the Proto-Indo-European people, the pale-skinned guys, who are supposed to have replaced the existing civilization there approximately 1000 BCE. On the other hand, there's always an on the other hand. And on the other hand, this professor, Nina Jablonski, who's the head of the Department of Anthropology in Penn State, she wrote this influential book, Skin, Natural History, where she says just 100 generations is enough for dark skin to become light and vice versa, approximately 2,500 years. If a population were to migrate to a northern latitude where it's cold, then once again the body's control system to respond how much of melanin to allow to inhibit vitamin D, versus if your body needs vitamin D, it suppresses that melanin, so skin becomes paler. Versus in India, for example, if people had this SLC A425, in northern India, these people also migrated to southern latitudes. Southern latitudes, Sri Lanka, they became darker and darker as they had to produce less and less vitamin that was needed. So it's purely the body control systems over here. So I think I'll skip this, then, or no, maybe I'll say this. There's some evidence for outward migration from India. So far we've been talking, debunking about Aryan invasions coming into India and saying, nah, it doesn't make sense. And here's an example where in 2013, they looked at the empty DNA from Bronze Age. I'll just explain what this is. They found some skeletons in Syria, skeletons related to the Roman period. And when they analyzed these guys and tried to say, what does their genetic parentage say where they are from? And the shock they found are related to the ancestral North Indian population. Okay? So that is the bottom line of this particular paper. How many of you feel this genetic thing is too much to talk about? Is it very intense? Does it make sense at all? You guys are okay? It's not too boring or difficult to understand, right? Okay. Today, the battlefield in genetics is geared not in the maternal mitochondrial DNA, it is a Y chromosomal data. Because that is where ambiguity exists, and the people who are tenaciously holding on to this narration of Proto-Indo-Europeans can only utilize the Y chromosomal data. The maternal DNA, empty DNA, tells a very strong record that I just showed you, Stephen Oppenheimer's work about the migration patterns. Remember that the presence of a woman in the genetic record implies stability. Okay? When a woman is there in an archaeological find or elsewhere, it implies settling down, it implies starting a family, it implies so many other things that we can associate with human dynamics. The presence of a man says nothing. It is an invasion. A guy can come and spread his DNA all over the place and go back to where he came from, right? That is why the narrator today is bands of male warriors. Do you guys see how the goalpost has been moved? The goalpost today says small bands of male warriors came from Central Asia and spread their genes in India, and they replaced the existing civilization. It is such an utterly bogus narrative in the context of some of the things that we are looking at. But today, anyway, the story is around the R1A. R1A is a mutation that is there in the Y chromosome. Okay? The R1A, Peter Underhill, by studying almost 16,000 individuals from 126 populations, he said it appeared in the record about 25,000 years ago, somewhere near Iran. And these gentlemen, Underhill, Keviset, and Mirabel, see the issue is like this. If you're going to look at genetic data that is 25,000 years old to tell a story of people who are just 5,000 years old, it's not a good idea. Right? It's not a good idea. You need measurements at 4,000 years, 5,000 years ago. Once you have measurements here, then your narration is a little more strong. So today, the story does not look at just R1A. They look at something called subclades. These subclades are Z282, Z93, which has approximately entered the genetic record about 6,000 years ago. So these people, Keviset, Mirabel, and Mascarenhas, they say that even these things seem to appear in South Asia or West Asia, or both in South Asia, Central Asia, or perhaps in West Asia. So even today, researchers have got a lot of difference of opinion. Where did these subclades originate? Even the Y chromosome is trying to say that it perhaps originated in South Asia and not in Central Asia. That is the story today. So my conclusion from genetic studies is that these results are only primary evidence and can only serve as supporting evidence. It's only primary evidence because of the lot of unknowns and subjective biases that have come into the process. One needs to study the sensitivity of the results to population size, composition, and assumptions. If I take a genetic study of, let's say, this classroom full of people, I want to make a conclusion. I see so many different nationalities perhaps here, different kinds. It's difficult to do that. So when somebody says, I made a genetic study with 30 individuals from this community, 30 from this region, 40 from that region, and so on, the question that you have to ask is, how sensitive is your conclusion if I take one individual out of this pool and put somebody else there? Are the results going to change? If your results are going to change, they're not robust, right? We need robust results. So it's very sensitive to population size, composition, assumptions. Need to be careful in attempting to align mathematical numbers alongside a narrative to avoid subjective biases creeping to the results. My conclusion, there is no evidence of a genetic inflow into India following a postulated Indo-European language expansion. There's neither Aryan gene nor a Dravidian gene. Essentially, the people are the same. The available evidence can equally be interpreted as an out-of-India theory. All right, that ends the genetics. You guys can breathe deep and relax. I'm now going to easier grounds. This is now talking about archaeology. All over India, you find ancient evidence from 40,000 years or so. Now, I dislike using terms like this, Stone Age, and so on, because these conjure up an image of a cartoonish image of an ancient man going on the club and beating a woman, dragging her by the hair to his cave, and ridiculous things like that, right? It does not. It infantilizes the ancients and imposes our biases into the past. I don't like that. But unfortunately, I took this from a secular source and I had to stick with these terminology. So these are the periods over here. All over India, you find archaeological finds that go up to about 40,000 years. That's the first story. Jwalapuram, 35,000 years ago, from this paper, Antiquity, June 2009, some implements found in this area. in Bhimbetka is in southern India, central India, 35,000 years ago, you find rock art. Not only rock art, you find evidence of a chap sitting on a horse. You find a horse and a guy sitting on a horse and holding some instrument. So it's not just domestication of horse, he's also using it for some kind of battle or something. Kerala, 9,000 years ago, Edakal caves, you find evidence of writing. And that writing is very interesting because it seems to have connection with the Harappa civilization. Some of the signs used in that Harappa cave are common with Harappa. So Birana, Rakhigar in Haryana, Punjab, 10,000 years ago, we find evidence of an urban find from 10,000 years ago today in Punjab. Ketavaram, Andhra Pradesh, 8,000 years ago, Ramachandrapuram, Telangana, 12,000 years ago, artifacts all over the place. Birana, so this is from an ASI paper 2008, and this shows from calendar year before present, 3,000 years approximately to 10,000 years, they found different kind of artifacts in various layers. Even 10 years ago, if I were to give this talk, people will laugh me all the way out of the hall, okay? They'll laugh at me saying, where is archaeological evidence for your talking about antiquity of the Indian people? These people only came to India in 1500 BCE. But now archaeology is matured to a point in India where we found artifacts from 10,000 years ago. So it seems to be supported by the archaeogenetics we just talked about. So there is support from two areas now over here. There is a narration that you might find in your textbooks that say that the earliest Indian civilization was the Indus Valley civilization. This is the disjoint in the Indian continuum because we know nothing about these guys. We don't know their language, we don't know what they ate, we don't know their governance, we don't know the script, we know nothing about them. All we know is they're supplanted by the Indus Valley, by the Aryans who came in later. That's all we know. However, this gentleman over here, Professor Abhayankar, in 1993 published this paper looking at two seals from Indus Valley, seal number 420 and seal number 430, where he said this shows the equinox and solstice position in 3000 BC. This Pashupati figure over here. These figurines over here are constellations that appear in the sky at certain points, the cardinal points of astronomy. Cardinal points of astronomy are the two equinoxes and the two solstices. Okay, where is the sun when a solstice point happened? What is the constellation there? To get an idea of constellation today, you can correlate with Capricorn, Aries, Cancer, and so on. Right? Ancients had their own kinds of things. So these figurines represent the cardinal points, and he said this corresponds to 3000 BCE. This one shows the 7 figures over here are the known planets and so on, and alignment that happened. I'm going to talk about this just a little later. So why did I put this? There are indications that there's a continuity of ideas in the Indian civilization. There's no discontinuity here. The Indus Valley people were connected to the people before them and after. So it's just one little example to show continuity. There's this paper that came out in Episodes in March 2003, where these gentlemen from National Institute of Ocean Technology in Chennai, India, they sent a sonar ship out there to Dwarka. Dwarka is off the west coast of India. And they did a sounding of the ocean floor to try and see what is there. And to their surprise, they found a 9-kilometer feature, 40 meters below the sea level, which appears to be a city wall. That is around below the city wall. They also dredged up a piece of wood from back there. And they sent it to 2 places for carbon dating. One is the National Geophysical Research Institute in Hyderabad, and the other one is Institute of Earth Science in Hanover, Germany. And both of them came back with a date of around 8,500 to 9,000 years before present. Once again, just a few years back, it was preposterous to bring in these kind of artifacts because they don't fit in with a known narration. But now we are finding multiple bodies of evidence that are correlating and saying, you've got to reevaluate all of those things. Here's one more example that talks about that. These days, there is a place called Kiradi, Tamil Nadu. Okay? It is outside a place called Madurai. How many of you have heard of Madurai? An ancient city in southern India. And you guys should try and visit it if possible at some point. He could not find an archaeological dig, the chief archaeologist over here, because Madurai is just like any other Indian city, completely occupied, populated, land is exceedingly expensive to obtain for a dig. So he used intuition and said, in those days, what would have been the supply chains for Madurai? They're bringing in food, they're bringing in other things. Where would have been the supply chains for Madurai? And what is 1 day's worth journey if you're doing it on a bullock cart or if you're doing it on a horse cart? What is 1 day's worth? So he said that 1 day's worth on that known supply chain, I'm going to dig there. And he struck gold. That is this place called Kirari. And he found an urban find in southern India. This is remarkable because urban finds are rare in southern India and more in northern India. Because the narration says, remember, Dravidians were driven to the south when Aryans came, 500 BCE. Urbanization happened much later, 200 BCE and so on. This find is very interesting. But the real story is over here. They sent samples from a 2-meter depth out of a 4.5-meter deposit for analysis to a lab in Florida, which came back saying that Kirari samples belong to the 3rd century BCE. However, I questioned this by saying that you have reported 4.5 meters depth of excavation. If the top layer is 2017, then 2 meters down, it is 2200 BCE by their own, 2200 years by their own dating. Which means every meter in depth corresponds to 1100 years linearly by their scale locally in that area. Which means 4.5 meters should correspond to 5000 years before present, approximately 3000 BCE. So a more honest narration from that field would have been, we found a range of artifacts from 3000 BCE all the way to 300 BCE. Okay? So they are not doing that because if they did something like that, it breaks the narrative that Indian kids are learning in India. Indian kids are learning about Aryan invasion, they're learning about Dravidians, they're learning about urbanization in southern India cannot be old. But here is the counterpoint that sits out there and staring at us. There's a place called Aricameda. Aricameda is in a place near Pondicherry. Okay? Pondicherry was a French colony for a pretty long time on the east coast of India, about 2 hours south of Chennai. And it was excavated early by this person called Mortimer Wheeler. Before that, it finds mention in something called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. I'll show that a little later. So this man who excavated Britisher, he said the time frame is 100 BCE to 100 current era. Why did he say that? Because he found a bust of Augustus Caesar there. And he said, when is Augustus Caesar? Around 50 BCE. All right, this must be around 100 BCE. That was the methodology they used for that. However, another archaeologist, Wimla Begley, in 1989, she said it must be revised to 200 BC to 700 BCE. However, today we find glass beads from Aricameda all over the Pacific. Okay? Wherever you go, if you Google and search for Indo-Pacific glass beads, you'll find hundreds of papers from Sumatra, from Malaysia, from Japan, from Korea. You find glass beads all of these places bearing the chemical signature of factories in Aricameda. Chemical signature meaning the minerals used with silica have got the mineral signature of factories over there. That's what it means. Wimla Begley, in her diary, she said that the oldest trench we uncovered was the 2nd century BCE. We had to stop working because we were under the water table and even a large pump could not keep the water out. In other words, it was not the terminus of finding artifacts that is 200 BCE, rather it was a technological impediment that prevented them from going deeper. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you guys. It must be a little overwhelming to keep up, but just be with me. I'm throwing to you evidence from various areas. I'll bring them all together in the end and try to tell you what the thesis is. So this is the archaeological evidence. In the Indian epics that are not used as sources of history, you find mention of geography all over India. So if you look at typical epics, you find out of India as well as in India, deeply tied to the geography of the land, but ignore the sources of history. This is what the textbooks tell us, including your own textbooks. Textbooks tell you that there was an Indus Valley civilization that commenced 5,000 years ago, declined 3,600 years ago in empty lands. So this is the dishonesty of the narration that you've been told. And you scratch your head and ask, what on earth are we learning? And there's so much of evidence out there for otherwise. So the Aryan invasion theory is false. Genetic evidence of great antiquity of Indian people. The non-African people of the world are descended from Indian stock. There is no evidence of genes from Central Asia from at least 12,500 years ago. Evidence of differentiation more than 6,000 years ago. There is no invasion. I didn't talk about this, but this climate change caused collapse of Indus Valley. Archaeology shows ancient artifacts that predate the so-called invasion period, whether in northern India, western India, southern or central India. How am I doing on the time, Sharat? Am I okay? Okay.
Another 5 minutes.
What's that again?
5 minutes.
5 minutes more? I had to stop in 5 minutes? Okay. I don't know what I'll tell in another 5 more minutes, but
Okay, 10.
So there's a paper out there that in 2014 that says that a 200-year drought cycle doomed the Indus Valley civilization. It was not invasion by the so-called Aryans and so on. It was more of a drought cycle that caused that. One more thing, if Aryan invasion, caste system, suppression of dragons supposed to have created widespread poverty in India today, if there was no Aryan invasion, the question is what caused poverty? I hope you guys see the cause and effect discourse that I'm bringing in over here. The cause of poverty is claimed to be caste system, is claimed to be what the Aryans brought in, and so on and so forth. If there's no Aryan invasion, what caused poverty in southern India and northern India? Today you find widespread evidence of that. So Angus Madison is a historical economist from Netherlands. Historical economist, meaning he studies the ancient economies of the world. And he studied from the year 1 of the Common Era all the way to 2003 and wrote a very influential book. He looked at the economies of the Middle East, India, China, Western Europe, and USA since 1700s in an effort to say what percentage of the world GDP did they occupy. And he found that India was the highest at approximately 33%, followed by China, and Europe was somewhere over here, Middle East was down here. India went on a downward decline through the invasion period, all the way down to 1600, 1700. You find the inflection point here when the Europeans came in. Once the Europeans came in, there was a rapid decline downwards. At the same time, the European fortunes went up. So what you see is an emptying of the Indian treasury and coffers and wealth into Western Europe, enriching those societies while impoverishing the Indian society. Very, very powerful indictment of what happened. One more very interesting book by this gentleman, you must have heard of him, Will Durant. He wrote an influential book called Case for India. It's a free book, you can download it on Google and read it. And he says the British forced Indians to sell cheap and buy exorbitantly. They taxed them at 2 times that of England. If England was charged, let's say, £1,000 a year, it's taxed Indians at £2,000. So I know factually from my family history how overnight taxation rate was changed to 56%. They caused instant overnight poverty so that the people had only one recourse. That one recourse was go and sit at the docks waiting for the British to take them as indentured servants to Trinidad, West Indies, to Malaysia and other places to work as labor. That's why today you find Indians in West Indies, you find them in Fiji, you find them in Mauritius, you find them all over the place. The British did that, taking them as indentured slaves. And at 3 times the taxation rate of Scotland. The cost of British conquest, development, administration, and everything was charged to Indians, meaning the wars they had with the French, the British-French wars, everything was charged to India, and they financed those things in that manner. He compiled this table saying in 1792, the British ran up a debt of $35 million for India. By the time it was 1860, it was $500 million, and when Will Durant came in 1930 to India, in 1929, it's $3.5 billion. The dollar is the dollar's value as of 1930s, not today's dollar. So you can imagine once the world wars came, how much more the British extracted. So the narration is, poverty that you see today in India was not an endemic phenomena going across generations, across centuries. It was not that. It started when the British came to India. That is the narration. It's not the caste system, it is not the Hindu system or any such thing. It is basically the economics of the British followed. I think I will not even go to archaeoastronomy because once I start there, there's at least half an hour's worth talk there. But very quickly flipping through my slides, I wanted to talk to you about precision. I wanted to talk to you about the nakshatra model, which ancient Indians use. I wanted to talk to you about how you do dating, not the dating that you do asking a girl or a boy out. This dating is an astronomical dating that you find a certain event in the scripture or in an epic. How are you going to say when did that happen? That dating I would like to teach you guys about. It's very simple. I'd like to teach you about it, but it's not possible now. I'd like to describe to you the night sky with an Indian lens about what this picture means over here. How did the ancient Indians look at the skies and make sense of all these constellations that you see in the circle over here? I'd like to talk to you about that. I would like to talk to you about a certain measurement that is made in Indian astronomy that is present even today called Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is present in something called Surya Siddhanta that says it is a rare planet conjunction of all the known planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and the Sun, all clustered in a certain constellation called Revati, the Revati Nakshatra. And my simulation of that in today's planetarium software shows the exact date to be February 18, 3102 BCE. And you see the Moon, you see Venus, you see Jupiter, and here is Mars, here is Mercury, and here is Saturn, all clustered in this constellation we call Revati. This is the measurement that has come to us in the very distant past, very, very distant past, and today we can actually use tools of archaeoastronomy and start measuring these things. There's an observation that is maintained in a text called the Mahabharata in this particular text, where it says, contesting against Abhijit. Abhijit is a star that in Greek we call Vega, okay? In Indians languages is Abhijit. The nakshatra is a constellation, Kritika is a Pleiades, okay? Pleiades. It went to the Vana, the summer solstice, to heat the summer. Abhijit slipped down in the sky. This is a statement that is there in the Mahabharata. And people said, it's ridiculous. Stars don't slip down in the sky. This is an example of somebody high on soma or some opium or something, writing these kinds of things. But now, Professor Vartak came along and said, if you consider this phenomenon called precession, precession is a phenomenon where what we are pointing to, today we are pointing to Polaris. Polaris is called Dhruva, okay? We are pointing to Polaris as a function of our Earth's rotation. It's pointing to that particular place. Dhruva or Polaris seems to be immobile in the night sky. In Houston, latitude of about 36 degrees, you see Dhruva in the sky, okay? However, our Earth has got 2 degrees of motion. Not only is it rotating once in 24 hours, it is also obviously going around the sun, it's also wobbling about its axis. Just like we have a spinning top, the top spins very, very fast in the primary motion, and sometimes it's got a slow wobble, right? That slow wobble, our Earth is doing that, okay? And that slow wobble takes 26,000 years to complete. As a consequence of that, today we are pointing here, but it slowly wobbles and might be pointing at some other fixed star in the sky. So there was a time where 15,000 years ago, when Abhijit was a pole star, it will again be 15,000 years from now, it will again be the pole star. And somebody has observed this in the Indian context and recorded that. Pleiades being at the summer solstice happened about 23,000 years ago. Bottom line, the rishis have been observing the skies from 24,000 years ago. Here's a simulation of Abhijit, 14,000 years ago. Vega was the pole star. There's a text in India called Shatapatha Brahmana that talks about Kritika never swerving from the east. I have a paper coming out a couple of months from now that describes this in more detail. This date can basically corresponds to the constellation Pleiades, where Pleiades is, and this line that you see, if I had time to describe this, this is the celestial equator. Okay? Celestial equator means if you project Earth's latitudes and longitudes to the sky, they become celestial coordinates. Celestial latitudes, celestial longitudes. So Earth's equator becomes celestial equator. On the day of the equinox, the sun is exactly on the celestial equator. 6 months the sun goes northward, 6 months sun goes southward. Okay? On the day of the equinox, it is on this. So this statement over here referred to when Kritika is on the celestial equator. And that was only possible on this particular date, April 15th, 2982 BCE. One more Taittiriya Samhita referring to Kritika in the winter solstice, and this could have happened only in 8921 BC as a consequence of that 26,000 year clock. We can talk about it. Agastya is a star called Canopus. Canopus is a star that's normally in the southern hemisphere, and we are the northern hemisphere, right? So normally we don't have a view of Canopus. I mean, you can't go and peek down there and see Canopus. You can't do that. But our tilt, Earth's tilt, basically the precession, has now afforded us a view of Canopus, such that Canopus comes in the northern hemisphere. Professor Abhyankar drew this map to show when would Canopus have been visible in southern India, Kanyakumari, 10,000 BCE, in New Delhi, 3000 BCE, and today we're somewhere over here. It's visible all over India. It'll eventually go on a disappearance cycle where it'll also disappear. So these things are also recorded in Indian texts, and we can make sense of this. My conclusion from astronomy is many instances of interest can be dated with astronomical observations. There are several dates preserved in texts that show very, very great antiquity. Today, the evidence of antiquity is backed by archaeological finds. 10 years back, I had no evidence at all. Now genetics is coming and archaeology is coming and showing all of these things. This is all ignored in today's scholarship due to the Eurocentric idea that Indian astronomy borrowed from the Greeks after 300 BCE to align with the pre-IE narratives. So I have two more sections which I don't have a chance of completing. So I'm going to flip by this and go to our conclusions, allowing you a chance to ask questions. So I wanted to talk to you about various things, including, maybe I'll just talk to you about this one particular text. There is a text from very ancient times. The dating of the text is disputed. It could either be 700 BCE, it could be 400 current era. Regardless of that, this text called Surya Siddhanta talks about astronomy, time cycles, and planetary diameters. Are you guys with me? Still awake? Planetary diameters. We are led to believe that only after Galileo found the telescope and looked at Jupiter and its moons, then we have been in a position to even estimate what the diameters would be. But this Indian text, which you can download in Google, look for the Burgess version of Surya Siddhanta's English translation and read it, talks about Mercury having a diameter. It didn't talk about miles, obviously, but this is a modern interpretation. 3008 miles, the true figure is 3032 miles. Talks about Saturn at 73,000 miles, the true figure is 74,000 miles. Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. There are some errors in Jupiter and Venus. But regardless of whether it's 400 BC or current era or 700 BCE, this is remarkable. So they used tools of trigonometry, and there are other things that I'd like to talk to you about if we had the time to go deeper into this concept and tell you about how did they do all these things without telescopes, that blob of sky, light moving the sky. They knew it was not just a light over there. They knew it had a dimension, and they were able to do it. At the same time, they couldn't do it for the stars. Why couldn't they do it for the stars, and why could they do it only for the planets? There's a story, there's mathematics that comes and helps you to understand why they did all those things. If we had time, maybe we could have talked about these things. Several ancient Indian mathematicians and astronomers. This person from the 11th century India, is a professor in astronomy, head of the department in Ujjain. He wrote this book, and he estimated the precision that I talked to you about. He estimated that at 25,461 years. This is the most modern figure we have, 25,771 years. He also discovered a field called differential calculus. Today we attribute it to Newton, Leibniz, and all these guys. But we have proof that the earliest differential calculus was in his works. Other mathematicians from Thrissur. There is today a discourse that says most of Indian knowledge is got from the Greeks. The Greeks had contact after Alexander tried to come into India and stopped it somewhere in Sindh and those areas. After that, they said the Indo-Greek civilizations provided impetus for knowledge transfers. I address that over here. I show routes for knowledge transfer, the Silk Route being one of them, and the Periplus of Erythraean Sea being another, then the Seleucid Empire being one more. I show knowledge outflows from India in pre-Pythagoras, Pythagoras, Alexander, Buddhist, Abbasid, Delhi Sultanate, Mughal periods, as well as the colonial period. In every period of time, we have evidence of knowledge getting out of India in various mechanisms. And there's documented things that we can bring to the discourse, talk about these things. Move further. So maybe this one little graph, and I'll stop over here, Shall this little last one top, end over here. Indic knowledge in various periods of time went over various routes to the rest of the world. It seeded the corpus of knowledge in other parts of the world. In one part, it went and impacted the Greeks and Romans. However, this knowledge of Greeks and Romans and the Indic people was destroyed when Constantine Christianity became the norm around 325 current era and so on. In an effort to stamp out pagan knowledge, they destroyed the temples, libraries, knowledge, and so on. So this chain of knowledge ended over there. However, Greek and Roman knowledge was also preserved in Arab lands. Lands like, of course, they're not Muslims in those days, Lands like Syria, Lebanon, Damascus, all these kind of areas are preserved in those lands. So the Arabs not only inherited that knowledge, they also destructively obtained knowledge from India. They were consolidators of knowledge into Arabic. And over here, I've shown to you a school of translation that happened in Toledo. Toledo was in the Christian side of Spain in the 10th century, whereas in the Muslim side of Spain, Cordoba was the capital. At that time, the Abbasid Empire stretched from India through northern Africa, all the way to Algiers, all the way to Spain. And they took the Sanskrit text translated to Arabic, in those days, the 10th century. In Toledo, there was a monastery whose only job was to translate Arabic texts into Latin and inject them into the Western discourse. We have one name from the past, Gerard of Cremona. Note it down and look it up later on. Gerard of Cremona translated 87 Arabic texts to Latin at Toledo in math, astronomy, and medicine. He's just one person. He's just one translator we know from the past. There were many, many, many people like him. And I have a paper coming out in this August that casts more light on these kinds of things. So this injection through the Romans, through the Greeks, through the Arabs went into Europe. Also, travelers from India to India in various periods of time, including the colonial people, directly took knowledge into Europe. And today it's repackaged and the citations have been removed. You might wonder, why did they remove citation? Were the Europeans really a dishonest people? We need to understand the context when they lived. They lived at a time when finally, in around the 14th, 15th century, the Pope and the Knights got their act together, and they managed to put together an army and rid Europe, Spain of the Moors. The Moors, the Muslims, right? They conquered them back. You know, but Isabella, Ferdinand, the guys who sponsored the ship of Columbus and all those guys. Same guys. At that time, there was also an Inquisition. The Inquisition was an attempt to stamp out pagan knowledge, to stamp out satanic knowledge. Any knowledge seen coming from the Muslims was seen as satanic knowledge. So there was an effort to stamp it out. At that time, they would go door to door, bashing down the doors and trying to see if you had any knowledge from them. If you're dead, you're off to the rack and they're going to teach you a lesson or two. So most people hid their sources. Most people hid their sources and went on saying, I discovered this, I discovered that. And you have this dishonest spectacle of Europe coming out of dark ages, oppression of the church, age of irrational, if you can call age of rationality, and before the irrationality, coming from disease and poverty, coming out and coming to the Renaissance saying, I invented this, I invented that. All of this can be traced back to the injection of knowledge in certain periods of time that allowed the corpus of knowledge to grow, and people were able to break free from the chains around them into the age of reason. That is an unacknowledged part of our history even today, and one of the greatest dishonesties of the Western narration today, that we don't talk about the sources. They are bereft of citations, and therefore I call them plagiarism. So there are a whole lot of evidence in various periods of time, different travelers who came to India and what knowledge went from here and there and so on. In the colonial period, what happened. And here's my closing remarks. I hope I've been coherent enough in trying to tell you these things at super fast pace, throwing all kinds of evidence at you and so on. This talk is really about 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes I stretch it into a workshop of an all day too. So I hope I've established evidence for an untold story of ancient India. I hope I told you there's no Aryan invasion or migration to India. The civilization has a cultural memory going back to 24,000 years at the very least. Indians produce knowledge in many, many fields. I didn't have occasion to talk to you about that. I'd love to talk to you about that and tell you what are the different areas. There's enormous knowledge transfers out of India in every time period. We have examined the evidence from genetics, astronomy, archaeology, literary sources, and knowledge transfers. And that is the end of my talk today. I hope I made sense to you guys. Thank you. Feel free to ask questions or rebut.
Any questions, please?
Yes.
Is there any way we can access this PowerPoint?
Yes, please go to iHeart channel on YouTube. iHeart channel on YouTube, and you'll find about 30 videos of mine over there. And some of them are just the PowerPoint slides. So you can go there, take a closer look at the references. Many of the slides I put my sources also, my reference, so you can follow through them and look at the data.
question. I forgot to actually mention this in my introduction. Dr. Vedam is the co-founder and director of this young think tank, the India History Awareness and Research, acronym IHAR. And I think he actually showed a slide from the members of the team. So they are now focusing on actually correcting the written history part, revisiting and critically analyzing India's written history. So one of the projects they undertook successfully is some revisions that were recommended for the textbooks in the state of Texas as well as in California. We did Texas.
Texas.
Yes.
Texas, yes.
And had a measure of success too with that. So it's an ongoing thing. So thank you very much, Dr. Vedam, and we are indeed richer today as a result of your knowledge, and as a token of appreciation, here are some samplers of the kinds of literature that we Westerners are accustomed to.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Any more questions? It's time for the next class, eh?
We hope to be able to bring you back. If time permits, I'm hopeful that we'll find a slot when we can focus on astronomy.
Yes. We'll be glad to.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. I hope you found it useful.